Well, it's a little bit of a lecture, I'm afraid, this morning, so bear with me. But I do think this is just a really important subject, so much so that when we discussed the subjects we were going to talk about as a team, I actually asked if I could talk about it, and I felt it was a big subject for our church right now, so it needed to be talked about over a couple of weeks. What sparked my concern was when Vicky talked about our church giving a couple of months ago. And she brought up a statistic that I found rather alarming. Apparently 53% of our giving comes from just 11 households. I know I said this last week, but hear it, folks. So that's alarming, I think, on two levels. Firstly, it makes us as a church a bit vulnerable. If anyone kicks the bucket or moves away, we have a bit of a problem. But much more importantly, it told me that it means that there must be a lot of other people who aren't giving very much. Now, these people may be giving very generously elsewhere to other charities, and if so, that's great. But what concerned me is that it could mean that there's a whole load of people here who aren't giving to God as they could and as they should, and therefore aren't learning God's principle of generosity. That if we give generously to God, God will give generously to us. And I felt actually quite sad about what those people might be missing. And that's the reason I felt I should talk about it now. But there's another reason. It's obviously very much harder for a vicar to talk about these things because they're the recipient of some of our money, or even for them to be there when someone else does. So it seemed to me quite important to give it an airing before our new vicar arrive. So fools rush in perhaps, but I'm going to have a go talking about it. And I don't want to harangue you and wag my finger and put you on a guilt trip, but I do want us all to have the chance to think and talk about it properly. So last week I talked about the whole idea that if we're absurdly generous to God, God will be absurdly generous to us, and the fact that we can't outgive God. And we looked at God's promise in the second book of Corinthians. He will always make you rich enough to be generous at all times. And I hope that last week we laid to rest the idea that you can only be generous if you happen to have a lot of spare money. I hope you've got that idea now. You don't have to be rich to be generous. But this week I want to look a bit more systematically at the whole principles behind giving. So I thought I'd start with a little quiz. I've got some multiple choice questions, and I'm not going to ask you to discuss or tell me about your answers, but just to think honestly what your response is. And actually a gut reaction I think is really quite good in these. So firstly, how do you see the idea of a tithe, what we heard about in the Leviticus reading, of giving a tenth? Do you see it as a biblical rule that still applies to Christians today? Do you see it as a principle that's relevant to Christians today, but the proportion is different? Do you think it was good in its time, but paying taxes to the nation has supplanted it? Or do you see it as an archaic invasion of freedom that was just instituted to give more power to the establishment? Next, how do you see your charitable giving? Do you have a sort of portfolio of planned giving that includes church? Do you give regularly to certain charities but you don't see your church offering as a part? Do you give whenever you happen to think about it or when you happen to be asked? Or do you feel that you really can't afford it, so you only give when your heartstrings are really tugged? Next, how do you see the church offering? Do you see it as giving to God and what happens to it isn't my problem? Do you see it as giving to God but you won't give if it's not used as you like? Do you see it more like paying a membership fee for the year regardless of attendance, or do you see it as paying for club facilities on a pay-as-you-use basis? And lastly, how do you see the idea of giving to the diocese? Do you believe it's important to support the wider church? It's good in principle, but I don't like what our diocese does. I haven't the faintest clue what our diocese does, or I think we should only support our local church. So I wonder what you thought about all those. I think within those there are a few answers that I think are clear-cut rights and wrongs, and also quite a few others that are shades of grey or matters of opinion. So I'm going to go back over them now, and I'm going to share some of my thoughts, and hopefully it will get all of us thinking and discussing and searching for what God wants. Firstly, what about tithing, this idea of giving 10% of your income? Well, it's clearly a biblical principle. It was repeated many times in the Old Testament. So does it still apply to us as Christians? Well, yes and no. It certainly isn't a rule. There is no rule in the New Testament for believers to tithe. And no, it obviously doesn't apply in the same way, and since many of the things that a tithe would have provided for in ancient times is now covered by our taxes and our welfare state. But having said that, there's no doubt that many in the early church did tithe, and many Christians through the ages have done so and still do so. Pete and I came from a Baptist church where the teaching was very much that Christians should tithe, should literally give away a tenth. And we chose to take that seriously and to take on board that challenge and promise from Malachi that we read last week. Bring a full amount of your tithe to the temple. Put me to the test, and you'll see that I'll open the windows of heaven for you. We've tried to stick with that throughout our married life, spreading our giving through several different charities, including church. And I'm not telling you this to show off, and I feel a bit embarrassed, quite honestly. I don't think it was anything heroic on our part that they just told us, so that's what we did. But I'm telling you, because over a lot of years now, I can tell you that it is possible, and it does work. Believe me, we've never been particularly rolling in money, and we've often struggled, especially when the children were young. But as Pete said last week, having chosen to give the tithe, it's the times when we've ignored it and let it slip that when our finances have descended into trouble. And the times when, despite giving, it seemed that it was impossible to give that much, things have turned out right. And long term, I certainly believe that God has blessed us far over and above what we might have expected. So, tithing is not a rule, but it is a possibility, and it is a challenge. I should perhaps add a comment, though, at this point, which is important. I talked about what Pete and I could do because we're both believers and we're able to agree on this. I'm aware that it's far harder if your partner isn't a believer and doesn't feel the same as you, so please don't feel burdened by this idea if that's your situation. So let's go on. How do we see giving? Well, the first thing to say is that as Christians, it's not just what we give away that matters, but how we use the money that we keep. God's concerned with what we do with all our money, and that involves all sorts of ethical choices, which I'm not going to even attempt to go into now. So giving is a part of a bigger picture of how we use our money. But for now, I want to focus on giving, and I'm assuming that most of us here are struggling with our finances with one extent or another, but we do also want to give. So how? A couple of weeks ago, John Bartlett brought up a word that I think is very important: intentionality. If you remember, John was confessing to a rather nerdy past as a train spotter, but he was pointing out that trains aren't just to look at, but to take us on a journey. And church isn't just something we come along to enjoy, it's here for a purpose. And he quoted the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, saying we need to be intentional about church growth. We're not just here for ourselves, we're here to extend the kingdom of God, to bring life and healing and forgiveness to others who need it. And part of that being intentional about God's kingdom is to plan our giving. So I don't think the proportion that we give is quite so important as the idea that we make a plan to give and we stick to it. If we only give what's left over at the end of the month, chances are we won't give at all. And as to what you give to, well, we'll come on to the church in a minute, but really there's a world of need out there. and the choice is yours. The important thing is to make the choice. And perhaps that probably means setting up standing orders as the best practical way to do it. Of course, we don't want to get so rigid that we never give away anything on impulse. But if we only wait for the impulse, we might find that it very rarely comes. How do we see our church offering? Let's be honest, in many ways, what we're doing when we put money in the church offering is paying subs to an organisation that we've chosen to belong to. And I don't think that's necessarily a wrong way to see it. I do certainly think it's wrong if we don't even see it that way. If we think church just exists to serve our needs and we shouldn't have to pay anything at all. If we think we're doing God or the vicar a favour just by turning up, then I think we might have got it a little bit skewed. Of course, church does exist to serve the needs of the community, and it doesn't insist anyone pay, and it doesn't check that anyone does, and I'm certainly not suggesting that we should go over to a system of demanding subs. But at the very least, surely everyone should be giving something realistic for what we're getting. If you belong to the National Trust, it costs you £41.50 a year. If you belong to Weight Watchers, it costs you £240 a year. If you're a member of Reigate Golf Club, it costs around £450 a year. So I wonder what sort of subs you feel it's worth paying to belong to church. I said it wasn't necessarily a wrong way to think about what we put in the church offering, but perhaps we need to realise that if that's all that's happening, that isn't really giving. Giving demands something much more. So let's go on. How do we see this idea of giving to the diocese? Could be a tricky one, this. I'm not going to go into lots of detail, but basically how it works is that roughly 2/3 of money given to our church goes back to the diocese. Most of that money then comes back to us to pay for the vicar and the vicarage. Some goes to the general overheads of the diocese. But the reason it's called fairer shares is that the diocese calculates how much they feel we ought to give them according to our numbers and the income bracket of our congregation. And basically the idea is it then allows for the clergy and vicars to be spread evenly and for wealthier and bigger congregations to support poorer and smaller ones. And our reading from Corinthians showed that this principle began almost as soon as the church was founded. The Christians in Judea were struggling. I don't know whether that was because of persecution or famine or whatever, but Paul organised for the other churches around the Mediterranean to give to them. As some of you may know, I worked for the diocese for a few years, putting together resources for the Woolwich area, and in that capacity I got to know and visit quite a few of the inner city churches in South London. And in my work for the Zimbabwe Link, I've also visited quite a few churches in the Croydon area. So believe me, as churches go in this diocese, we're really far better off than most, both in what we have as a church and also in our own personal standards of living generally. Now, I know how generous everyone here has been for the churches in Zimbabwe, but I do wonder, and I'll put this up as a challenge, whether we've lost that vision for the needs of our brothers and sisters in the inner city, and perhaps we need to regain that a little. So, we can see that the principle of giving to the diocese is biblical. We should support other churches at home and abroad. Now, that's all very well, I hear some of you thinking, but unfortunately we've had a problem in recent years of the diocese telling us that we should pay what our PCC agrees is unrealistic. Personally, I'm inclined to agree that they do calculate it rather strangely, to say the least, and I think basically it's a bad system. And I'm very glad to report that the Archbishop of Canterbury and also St Paul agree with me. Paul says, I'm not laying down any rules. He's laying down the principle of giving, but he's not laying down a rule of how much. And Justin Welby, in his short tenure as Bishop of Durham, actually completely did away with the parish share system for that diocese because he said it simply didn't work. And so he turned it on its head. He didn't ask parishes to contribute certain amounts, but asked them prayerfully to consider what they could give and then give it, and apparently giving went up and not down. But that was Durham, and unfortunately he hasn't brought that in for the whole Church of England. The system for our diocese is due to change in a couple of years, I think, but I'm not sure how. However, at the moment, we do still have that outstanding issue of money they say we should pay that we do still need to resolve. Now, Peter Marsh, our Treasurer, is continuing to do a sterling job on negotiating that, and I do think that we should pray that there is a realistic solution. But alongside that, I think it would be great if our giving went up enough to put the whole thing back on a balanced footing. Because I think the thing is that until we do, we won't really be able to start looking fully at a church, at our intentions, what we want to give money for, the things we'd love to happen here and elsewhere, and we won't be blessing others as we should. Now, there's one final issue, I think, that needs to be very quickly addressed, and that's the issue of whether we feel the money we give is well spent, whether it's to this church, to the diocese, or to any other charities. Of course, we should be concerned that money is used well, but let's be real. Any charity and any church is only made up of human beings. There are times within any organisation when plans are made badly, employees don't live up to expectations, things get corrupted or go pear-shaped, and money gets wasted. If we only gave to an organisation that gave every penny we used to the full, then we'd probably never give at all. I'm sure there are times when money gets wasted, and I can think of one or two instances in Southwark and in Zimbabwe that I know about, but in general, I think we can be enormously grateful that both dioceses are headed by people of integrity and that generally our money is used very well. But in a way, that doesn't matter. There's a sense in which it's our responsibility to give to God and God's responsibility to use what we give. You might remember the story of the woman who came and poured expensive perfume over Jesus' feet. And lots of those who looked on thought it was a ridiculous, extravagant waste. But Jesus applauded this absurd generosity, waste or not, because he knew it came from a heart of worship and of love. So let's just give generously and not get too hung up if here or there's something that isn't quite as we'd like it. It's interesting that when you start looking at any subject, I find how often something else comes up about it from a place you hadn't expected. And that happened to me this week in our house group. We've been looking at the book Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. And he had some things to say on the subject that are quite relevant. So I'm going to end now with them. Lewis says, "I don't believe we can settle how much we ought to give. I'm afraid the only safe rule is to give more than we can spare. If our giving doesn't at all pinch or hamper us, I should say it's too small." And he went on to say, for many of us, the great obstacle to giving lies not in our luxurious living or our desire for more money, but in our fear of insecurity. Absurd generosity takes courage. I wonder if we as a church have the courage to take it on.